Miss King, an Ashenden Spy-Detective Story by Somerset Maugham. It was not till the beginning of September that Ashenden, a writer by profession who had been abroad at the outbreak of the war, managed to get back to England. He chanced, soon after his arrival, to go to a party and was there introduced to a middle-aged colonel whose name he did not catch. He had some talk with him. As he was about to leave, this officer came up to him and asked, "I say, I wonder if you'd mind coming to see me. I'd rather like to have a chat with you." "Certainly," said Ashenden, "whenever you like." "What about tomorrow at 11? "All right. I'll just write down my address. Have you a card on you?" Ashenden gave him one, and on this the colonel scribbled in pencil the name of a street and the number of a house. When Ashenden walked along next morning to keep his appointment, he found himself in a street of rather vulgar red-brick houses in a part of London that had once been fashionable, but was now fallen in the esteem of the house hunter who wanted a good address. On the house at which Ashenden had been asked to call, there was a board up to announce that it was for sale. The shutters were closed, and there was no sign that anyone lived in it. He rang the bell, and the door was opened by a non-commissioned officer so promptly that he was startled. He was not asked his business, but led immediately into a long room at the back, once evidently a dining room, the florid decoration of which looked oddly out of keeping with the office furniture, shabby and sparse, that was in it. It gave Ashenden the impression of a room in which the brokers had taken possession. The colonel, who was known in the intelligence department, as Ashenden later discovered, by the letter R, rose when he came in and shook hands with him. He was a man somewhat above the middle height, lean, with a yellow, deeply lined face, thin grey hair, and a toothbrush moustache. The thing immediately noticeable about him was the closeness with which his blue eyes were set. He only just escaped a squint. They were hard and cruel eyes and very wary, and they gave him a cunning, shifty look. Here was a man that you could neither like nor trust at first sight. His manner was pleasant and cordial. He asked Ashenden a good many questions, and then, without further ado, suggested that he had particular qualifications for the Secret Service. Ashenden was acquainted with several European languages, and his profession was excellent cover. On the pretext that he was writing a book, he could, without attracting attention, visit any neutral country. It was while they were discussing this point that R said, "You know, you ought to get material that would be very useful to you in your work." "I shouldn't mind that," said Ashenden. "I'll tell you an incident that occurred only the other day, and I can vouch for its truth. I thought at the time it would make a damned good story. One of the French ministers went down to Nice to recover from a cold, and he had some very important documents with him that he kept in a dispatch case. They were very important indeed. Well, a day or two after he arrived, he picked up a yellow-haired lady at some restaurant or other where there was dancing, and he got very friendly with her. To cut a long story short, he took her back to his hotel. Of course, it was a very imprudent thing to do, and when he came to himself in the morning, the lady and the dispatch case had disappeared. They had 1 or 2 drinks up in his room, and his theory is that when his back was turned, the woman slipped a drug into his glass." R finished, and looked at Ashenden with a gleam in his close-set eyes. "Dramatic, isn't it?" he asked. "Do you mean to say that happened the other day?" "The week before last." "Impossible!" cried Ashenden. "Why, we've been putting that incident on the stage for 60 years. We've written it in 1,000 novels. Do you mean to say that life has only just caught up with us?" R was a trifle disconcerted. "Well, if necessary, I could give you names and dates, and believe me, the Allies have been put to no end of trouble by the loss of the documents that the dispatch case contained." "Well, sir, if you can't do better than that in the Secret Service," sighed Ashenden, I'm afraid that as a source of inspiration to the writer of fiction, it's a washout. We really can't write that story much longer. It did not take them long to settle things, and when Ashenden rose to go, he had already made careful note of his instructions. He was to start for Geneva next day. The last words that R said to him, with a casualness that made them impressive, were, "There's just one thing I think you ought to know before you take on this job, and don't forget it. If you do well, you'll get no thanks, and if you get into trouble, you'll get no help. Does that suit you?" "Perfectly." "Then I'll wish you good afternoon." Ashenden was on his way back to Geneva. The night was stormy, and the wind blew cold from the mountains, but the stodgy little steamer plodded sturdily through the choppy waters of the lake. A scudding rain, just turning into sleet, swept the deck in angry gusts, like a nagging woman who cannot leave a subject alone. Ashenden had been to France in order to write and dispatch a report. A day or two before, about 5 in the afternoon, an Indian agent of his had come to see him in his rooms. It was only by a lucky chance that he was in, for he had no appointment with him, and the agent's instructions were to come to the hotel only in a case of urgent importance. He told Ashenden that a Bengali in the German service had recently come from Berlin with a black cane trunk in which were a number of documents interesting to the British government. At that time, the Central Powers were doing their best to foment such an agitation in India as would make it necessary for Great Britain to keep their troops in the country and perhaps send others from France. It had been found possible to get the Bengali arrested in Bern on a charge that would keep him out of harm's way for a while, but the black cane trunk could not be found. Ashenden's agent was a very brave and very clever fellow, and he mixed freely with such of his countrymen as were disaffected to the interests of Great Britain. He had just discovered that the Bengali, before going to Bern, had, for greater safety, left the trunk in the cloakroom at Zurich station, and now that he was in jail, awaiting trial, was unable to get the bulletin by which it might be obtained into the hands of any of his confederates. It was a matter of great urgency for the German intelligence department to secure the contents of the trunk without delay, and since it was impossible for them to get hold of it by the ordinary official means, they had decided to break into the station that very night and steal it. It was a bold and ingenious scheme, and Ashenden felt a pleasant exhilaration, for a great deal of his work was uncommonly dull, when he heard of it. He recognized the dashing and unscrupulous touch of the head of the German Secret Service at Bern. But the burglary was arranged for 2 o'clock on the following morning, and there was not a moment to lose. He could trust neither the telegraph nor the telephone to communicate with the British officer at Bern, and since the Indian agent could not go, he was taking his life in his hands by coming to see Ashenden, and if he were noticed leaving his room, it might easily be that he would be found one day floating in the lake with a knife thrust in his back. There was nothing for it but to go himself. There was a train to Bern that he could just catch, and he put on his hat and coat as he ran downstairs. He jumped into a cab. 4 hours later, he rang the bell of the headquarters of the intelligence department. His name was known there but to one person, and it was for him that Ashenden asked. A tall, tired-looking man, whom he had not met before, came out and, without a word, led him into an office. Ashenden told him his errand. The tall man looked at his watch. "It's too late for us to do anything ourselves. We couldn't possibly get to Zurich in time." He reflected. "We'll put the Swiss authorities on the job. They can telephone. And when your friends attempt their little burglary, I have no doubt they'll find the station well guarded. Anyhow, you had better get back to Geneva." He shook hands with Ashenden and showed him out. Ashenden was well aware that he would never know what happened then. Being no more than a tiny rivet in a vast and complicated machine, he never had the advantage of seeing a completed action. He was concerned with the beginning or the end of it, perhaps, or with some incident in the middle, but what his own doings led to, he had seldom a chance of discovering. It was as unsatisfactory as those modern novels that give you a number of unrelated episodes and expect you, by piecing them together, to construct in your mind a connected narrative. Notwithstanding his fur coat and his muffler, Ashenden was chilled to the bone. It was warm in the saloon, and there were good lights to read by, but he thought it better not to sit there in case some habitual traveller, recognizing him, wondered why he made these constant journeys between Geneva in Switzerland and Thonon in France. And so, making the best of what shelter could be found, he passed the tedious time in the darkness of the deck. He looked in the direction of Geneva, but could see no lights, and the sleet, turning into snow, prevented him from recognizing the landmarks. Lake Leman, on fine days so trim and pretty, artificial like a piece of water in a French garden, in this tempestuous weather was as secret and as menacing as the sea. He made up his mind that on getting back to his hotel he would have a fire lit in his sitting room, a hot bath, and dinner comfortably by the fireside in pyjamas and a dressing gown. The prospect of spending an evening by himself with his pipe and a book was so agreeable that it made the misery of that journey across the lake positively worthwhile. Two sailors tramped past him heavily, their heads bent down to save themselves from the sleet that blew in their faces, and one of them shouted to him, "Nous arrivons!" They went to the side and withdrew a bar to allow passage for the gangway. And looking again, Ashenden, through the howling darkness, saw mistily the lights of the quay. A welcome sight. In 2 or 3 minutes the steamer was made fast, and Ashenden, muffled to the eyes, joined himself to the little knot of passengers that waited to step ashore. Though he made the journey so often, it was his duty to cross the lake into France once a week to deliver his reports and to receive instructions. He had always a faint sense of trepidation when he stood among the crowd at the gangway and waited to land. There was nothing on his passport to show that he had been in France. The steamer went round the lake, touching French soil at 2 places, but going from Switzerland to Switzerland, so that his journey might have been to Vevey or to Lausanne. But he could never be sure that the secret police had not taken note of him, and if he had been followed and seen to land in France, the fact that there was no stamp on his passport would be difficult to explain. Of course he had his story ready, but he well knew that it was not a very convincing one, and though it might be impossible for the Swiss authorities to prove that he was anything but a casual traveller, he might nevertheless spend 2 or 3 days in jail, which would be uncomfortable, and then be firmly conducted to the frontier, which would be mortifying. The Swiss knew well that their country was the scene of all manner of intrigues. Agents of the Secret Service, spies, revolutionaries and agitators infested the hotels of the principal towns, and jealous of their neutrality, they were determined to prevent conduct that might embroil them with any of the belligerent powers. There were, as usual, 2 police officers on the quay to watch the passengers disembark, and Ashenden, walking past them with as unconcerned an air as he could assume, was relieved when he had got safely by. The darkness swallowed him up, and he stepped out briskly for his hotel. The wild weather, with a scornful gesture, had swept all the neatness from the trim promenade. The shops were closed, and Ashenden passed only an occasional pedestrian who sidled along, scrunched up, as though he fled from the blind wrath of the unknown. You had a feeling in that black and bitter night that civilization, ashamed of its artificiality, cowered before the fury of elemental things. It was hail now that blew in Ashenden's face, and the pavement was wet and slippery, so that he had to walk with caution. The hotel faced the lake. When he reached it, and a page boy opened the door for him, he entered the hall with a flurry of wind that sent the papers on the porter's desk flying into the air. Ashenden was dazzled by the light. He stopped to ask the porter if there were letters for him. There was nothing, and he was about to get into the lift when the porter told him that two gentlemen were waiting in his room to see him. Ashenden had no friends in Geneva. "Oh?" he answered, not a little surprised. "Who are they?" He had taken care to get on friendly terms with the porter, and his tips for trifling services had been generous. The porter gave a discreet smile. "There is no harm in telling you. I think they are members of the police." "What do they want?" asked Ashenden. "They did not say. They asked me where you were, and I told them you had gone for a walk. They said they would wait till you came back." "How long have they been there?" "An hour." Ashenden's heart sank, but he took care not to let his face betray his concern. "I'll go up and see them," he said. The liftman stood aside to let him step into the lift, but Ashenden shook his head. "I'm so cold," he said. "I'll walk up." He wished to give himself a moment to think, but as he ascended the 3 flights slowly, his feet were like lead. There could be small doubt why 2 police officers were so bent upon seeing him. He felt on a sudden dreadfully tired. He did not feel he could cope with a multitude of questions. And if he were arrested as a secret agent, he must spend at least the night in a cell. He longed more than ever for a hot bath and a pleasant dinner by his fireside. He had half a mind to turn tail and walk out of the hotel, leaving everything behind him. He had his passport in his pocket, and he knew by heart the hours at which trains started for the frontier. Before the Swiss authorities had made up their minds what to do, he would be in safety. But he continued to trudge upstairs. He did not like the notion of abandoning his job so easily. He had been sent to Geneva, knowing the risks, to do work of a certain kind, and it seemed to him that he had better go through with it. Of course, it would not be very nice to spend 2 years in a Swiss prison, but the chance of this was, like assassination to kings, one of the inconveniences of his profession. He reached the landing of the 3rd floor and walked to his room. Ashenden had in him, it seems, a strain of flippancy, on account of which, indeed, the critics had often reproached him, and as he stood for a moment outside the door, his predicament appeared to him on a sudden rather droll. His spirits went up, and he determined to brazen the thing out. It was with a genuine smile on his lips that he turned the handle and, entering the room, faced his visitors. "Good evening, gentlemen," said he. The room was brightly lit, for all the lights were on, and a fire burned in the hearth. The air was grey with smoke, since the strangers, finding it long to wait for him, had been smoking strong and inexpensive cigars. They sat in their greatcoats and bowler hats as though they had only just that moment come in. But the ashes in the little tray on the table would alone have suggested that they had been long enough there to make themselves familiar with their surroundings. They were 2 powerful men with black moustaches on the stout side, heavily built, and they reminded Ashenden of Fafner and Fasolt, the giants in the Rheingold. Their clumsy boots, the massive way they sat in their chairs, and the ponderous alertness of their expression made it obvious that they were members of the detective force. Ashenden gave his room an enveloping glance. He was a neat creature, and saw at once that his things, though not in disorder, were not as he had left them. He guessed that an examination had been made of his effects. That did not disturb him, for he kept in his room no document that would compromise him. His code he had learned by heart and destroyed before leaving England, and such communications as reached him from Germany were handed to him by third parties and transmitted without delay to the proper places. There was nothing he need fear in a search, but the impression that it had been made confirmed his suspicion that he had been denounced to the authorities as a secret agent. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" he asked affably. "It's warm in here. Wouldn't you like to take off your coats and hats?" It faintly irritated him that they should sit there with their hats on. "We're only staying a minute," said one of them. "We were passing, and as the concierge said you would be in at once, we thought we would wait." He did not remove his hat. Ashenden unwrapped his scarf and disembarrassed himself of his heavy coat. "Won't you have a cigar?" he asked, offering the box to the two detectives in turn. "I don't mind if I do," said the first, Fafner, taking one, upon which the second, Fasolt, helped himself without a word, even of thanks. The name on the box appeared to have a singular effect on their manners, for both now took off their hats. "You must have had a very disagreeable walk in this bad weather," said Fafner, as he bit half an inch off the end of his cigar and spat it in the fireplace. Now, it was Ashenden's principle, a good one in life as well as in the intelligence department, always to tell as much of the truth as he conveniently could. So he answered as follows. "What do you take me for? I wouldn't go out in such weather if I could help it. I had to go to Vivi today to see an invalid friend, and I came back by boat. It was bitter on the lake." "We come from the police," said Fafner casually. Ashenden thought they must consider him a perfect idiot if they imagined he had not guessed that, but it was not a piece of information to which it was discreet to reply with a pleasantry. "Oh, really?" he said. "Have you your passport on you?" "Yes. In these war times, I think a foreigner is wise always to keep his passport on him." "Very wise." Ashenden handed the man the nice new passport, which gave no information about his movements other than that he had come from London 3 months before and had since then crossed no frontier. The detective looked at it carefully and passed it on to his colleague. "It appears to be all in order," he said. Ashenden, standing in front of the fire to warm himself, a cigarette between his lips, made no reply. He watched the detectives warily, but with an expression, he flattered himself, of amiable unconcern. Fasold handed back the passport to Fafner, who tapped it reflectively with a thick forefinger. "The chief of police told us to come here," he said, and Ashenden was conscious that both of them now looked at him with attention, "to make a few inquiries of you." Ashenden knew that when you have nothing apposite to say, it is better to hold your tongue, and when a man has made a remark that calls to his mind for an answer, he is apt to find silence a trifle disconcerting. Ashenden waited for the detective to proceed. He was not quite sure, but it seemed to him that he hesitated. "It appears that there have been a good many complaints lately of the noise that people make when they come out of the casino late at night. We wish to know if you personally have been troubled by the disturbance. It is evident that as your rooms look on the lake and the revelers pass your windows, if the noise is serious, you must have heard it." For an instant, Ashenden was dumbfounded. What balderdash was this? The detective was talking to him. Boom, boom, he heard the big drum as the giant lumbered on the scene. And why on earth should the chief of police send to him to find out if his beauty sleep had been disturbed by vociferous gamblers? It looked very like a trap. But nothing is so foolish as to ascribe profundity to what on the surface is merely inept. It is a pitfall into which many an ingenuous reviewer has fallen headlong. Ashenden had a confident belief in the stupidity of the human animal, which in the course of his life had stood him in good stead. It flashed across him that if the detective asked him such a question, it was because he had no shadow of proof that he was engaged in any illegal practice. It was clear that he had been denounced, but no evidence had been offered, and the search of his rooms had been fruitless. But what a silly excuse was this to make for a visit, and what a poverty of invention it showed. Ashenden immediately thought of 3 reasons the detectives might have given for seeking an interview with him, and he wished that he were on terms sufficiently familiar with them to make the suggestions. This was really an insult to the intelligence. These men were even stupider than he thought. But Ashenden had always a soft corner in his heart for the stupid, and now he looked upon them with a feeling of unexpected kindliness. He would have liked to pat them gently, but he answered the question with gravity. "To tell you the truth, I am a very sound sleeper, the result doubtless of a pure heart and an easy conscience, and I have never heard a thing. Ashenden looked at them for the faint smile that he thought his remark deserved, but their countenances remained stolid. Ashenden, as well as an agent of the British government, was a humorist, and he stifled the beginnings of a sigh. He assumed a slightly imposing air and adopted a more serious tone. But even if I had been awakened by noisy people, I should not dream of complaining. At a time when there is so much trouble, misery, and unhappiness in the world, I cannot but think it very wrong to disturb the amusement of persons who are lucky enough to be able to amuse themselves. "En effet," said the detective, "but the fact remains that people have been disturbed, and the chief of police thought the matter should be inquired into." His colleague, who had hitherto preserved a silence that was positively sphinx-like, now broke it. "I notice by your passport that you are an author, monsieur," he said. Ashenden, in reaction from his previous perturbation, was feeling exceedingly debonair, and he answered with good humour, "It is true, it is a profession full of tribulation, but it has now and then its compensations." "La gloire," said Fafner politely. "Or shall we say notoriety?" hazarded Ashenden. "And what are you doing in Geneva?" The question was put so pleasantly that Ashenden felt it behoved him to be on his guard. A police officer amiable is more dangerous to the wise than a police officer aggressive. "I am writing a play," said Ashenden. He waved his hand to the papers on his table. 4 eyes followed his gesture. A casual glance told him that the detectives had looked and taken note of his manuscripts. "And why should you write a play here rather than in your own country?" Ashenden smiled upon them with even more affability than before, since this was a question for which he had long been prepared, and it was a relief to give the answer. He was curious to see how it would go down. "Mais, monsieur, there is the war. My country is in turmoil. It would be impossible to sit there quietly and write a play." "Is it a comedy or a tragedy?" "Oh, a comedy, and a light one at that," replied Ashenden. "The artist needs peace and quietness. How do you expect him to preserve that detachment of spirit that is demanded by creative work unless he can have perfect tranquility? Switzerland has the good fortune to be neutral, and it seemed to me that in Geneva I should find the very surroundings I wanted." Fafner nodded slight to Fasolt, but whether to indicate that he thought Ashenden an imbecile, or whether in sympathy with his desire for a safe retreat from a turbulent world, Ashenden had no means of knowing. Anyhow, the detective evidently came to the conclusion that he could learn nothing more from talking to Ashenden, for his remarks grew now desultory, and in a few minutes he rose to go. When Ashenden, having warmly shaken their hands, closed the door behind the pair, he heaved a great sigh of relief. He turned on the water for his bath, as hot as he thought he could possibly bear it, and as he undressed, reflected comfortably over his escape. The day before, an incident had occurred that had left him on his guard. There was in his service a Swiss, known in the intelligence department as Bernard, who had recently come from Germany, and Ashenden, desiring to see him, had instructed him to go to a certain café at a certain time. Since he had not seen him before, so that there might be no mistake, he had informed him through an intermediary what question himself would ask and what reply he was to give. He chose the luncheon hour for the meeting, since then the café was unlikely to be crowded, and it chanced that on entering he saw but one man of about the age he knew Bernard to be. He was by himself, and going up to him. Ashenden casually put to him the pre-arranged question. The pre-arranged answer was given, and sitting down beside him, Ashenden ordered himself a Dubonnet. The spy was a stocky little fellow, shabbily dressed, with a bullet-shaped head, close-cropped, fair, with shifty blue eyes and a sallow skin. He did not inspire confidence, and but that Ashenden knew by experience how hard it was to find men willing to go into Germany, He would have been surprised that his predecessor had engaged him. He was a German Swiss and spoke French with a strong accent. He immediately asked for his wages, and these Ashenden passed over to him in an envelope. They were in Swiss francs. He gave a general account of his stay in Germany and answered Ashenden's careful questions. He was by calling a waiter and had found a job in a restaurant near one of the Rhine bridges, which gave him good opportunity to get the information that was required of him. His reasons for coming to Switzerland for a few days were plausible, and there could apparently be no difficulty in his crossing the frontier on his return. Ashenden expressed his satisfaction with his behavior, gave him his orders, and was prepared to finish the interview. "Very good," said Bernard. "But before I go back to Germany, I want 2,000 francs. "Do you?" "Yes, and I want them now, before you leave this cafe. It's a sum I have to pay, and I've got to have it." "I'm afraid I can't give it to you." A scowl made the man's face even more unpleasant to look at than it was before. "You've got to. What makes you think that?" The spy leaned forward, and not raising his voice, but speaking so that only Ashenden could hear, burst out angrily, "Do you think I'm going on risking my life for that beggarly sum you give me? Not 10 days ago, a man was caught at Mainz and shot. Was that one of your men?" "We haven't got anyone at Mainz," said Ashenden carelessly, and for all he knew, it was true. He had been puzzled not to receive his usual communications from that place, and Bernard's information might afford the explanation. "You knew exactly what you were to get when you took on the job, and if you weren't satisfied, you needn't have taken it. I have no authority to give you a penny more." "Do you see what I've got here?" said Bernard. He took a small revolver out of his pocket and fingered it significantly. "What are you going to do with it? Pawn it?" With an angry shrug of the shoulders, he put it back in his pocket. Ashenden reflected that had he known anything of the technique of the theatre, Bernard would have been aware that it was useless to make a gesture that had no ulterior meaning. "You refuse to give me the money?" "Certainly." The spy's manner, which at first had been obsequious, was now somewhat truculent, but he kept his head and never for a moment raised his voice. Ashenden could see that Bernard, however big a ruffian, was a reliable agent, and he made up his mind to suggest to R that his salary should be raised. The scene diverted him. A little way off, 2 fat citizens of Geneva, with black beards, were playing dominoes, and on the other side, a young man with spectacles was with great rapidity writing sheet after sheet of an immensely long letter. A Swiss family, who knows perhaps Robinson by name, consisting of a father and mother and 4 children, were sitting round a table making the best of 2 small cups of coffee. The caissier behind the counter, an imposing brunette with a large bust encased in black silk, was reading the local paper. The surroundings made the melodramatic scene in which Ashenden was engaged perfectly grotesque. His own play seemed to him much more real. Bernard smiled. His smile was not engaging. "Do you know that I have only to go to the police and tell them about you to have you arrested? Do you know what a Swiss prison is like?" "No, I've often wondered lately. Do you?" "Yes, and you wouldn't much like it." One of the things that had bothered Ashenden was the possibility that he would be arrested before he finished his play. He disliked the notion of leaving it half done for an indefinite period. He did not know whether he would be treated as a political prisoner or as a common criminal, and he had a mind to ask Bernard whether in the latter case, the only one Bernard was likely to know anything about, he would be allowed writing materials. He was afraid Bernard would think the inquiry an attempt to laugh at him, but he was feeling comparatively at ease and was able to answer Bernard's threat without heat. "You could, of course, get me sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. At least." "No, that is the maximum, I understand, and I think it is quite enough. I won't conceal from you that I should find it extremely disagreeable, but not nearly so disagreeable as you would." "What could you do?" "Oh, we'd get you somehow, And after all, the war won't last forever. You are a waiter. You want your freedom of action. I promise you that if I get into any trouble, you will never be admitted into any of the Allied countries for the rest of your life. I can't help thinking it would cramp your style." Bernard did not reply, but looked down sulkily at the marble-topped table. Ashenden thought this was the moment to pay for the drinks and go. "Think it over, Bernard," he said. "If you want to go back to your job, you have your instructions, and your usual wages shall be paid through the usual channels." The spy shrugged his shoulders, and Ashenden, though not knowing in the least what was the result of their conversation, felt that it behoved him to walk out with dignity. He did so. And now, as he carefully put one foot into the bath, wondering if he could bear it, he asked himself what Bernard had in the end decided on. The water was just not scalding, and he gradually let himself down into it. On the whole, it seemed to him that the spy had thought it would be as well to go straight, and the source of his denunciation must be looked for elsewhere, perhaps in the hotel itself. Ashenden lay back, and as his body grew used to the heat of the water, gave a sigh of satisfaction. Really, he reflected, there are moments in life when all this to-do that has led from the primeval slime to myself seems almost worthwhile. Ashenden could not but think he was lucky to have wriggled out of the fix he had found himself in that afternoon. Had he been arrested and in due course sentenced, R, shrugging his shoulders, would merely have called him a damned fool and set about looking for someone to take his place. Already Ashenden knew his chief well enough to be aware that when he had told him that if he got into trouble, he need look for no help, he meant exactly what he said. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Ashenden, lying comfortably in his bath, was glad to think that in all probability he would be able to finish his play in peace. The police had drawn a blank, and though they might watch him from now on with some care, it was unlikely that they would take a further step until he had at least roughed out his third act. It behoved him to be prudent. Only a fortnight ago, his colleague at Lausanne had been sentenced to a term of imprisonment. But it would be foolish to be alarmed. His predecessor in Geneva, seeing himself, with an exaggerated sense of his own importance, shadowed from morning till night, had been so affected by the nervous strain that it had been found necessary to withdraw him. Twice a week, Ashenden had to go to the market to receive instructions that were brought to him by an old peasant woman from French Savoy who sold butter and eggs. She came in with the other market women, and the search at the frontier was perfunctory. It was barely dawn when they crossed, and the officials were only too glad to have done quickly with these chattering, noisy women and get back to their warm fires and their cigars. Indeed, this old lady looked so bland and innocent, with her corpulence, her fat red face, and her smiling, good-natured mouth. It would have been a very astute detective who could imagine that if he took the trouble to put his hand deep down between those voluminous breasts of hers, he would find a little piece of paper that would land in the dock an honest old woman who kept her son out of the trenches by taking this risk, and an English writer approaching middle age. Ashenden went to the market about 9, when the housewives of Geneva, for the most part, had done their provisioning, stopped in front of the basket, by the side of which, rain or wind, hot or cold, sat that indomitable creature, and bought half a pound of butter. She slipped the note into his hand when he was given change for 10 francs, and he sauntered away. His only moment of risk was when he walked back to his hotel with the paper in his pocket, and after this scare, he made up his mind to shorten as much as possible the period during which it could be found on him. Ashenden sighed, for the water was no longer quite so hot. He could not reach the tap with his hand, nor could he turn it with his toes, as every properly regulated tap should turn. And if he got up enough to add more hot water, he might just as well get out altogether. On the other hand, he could not pull out the plug with his foot in order to empty the bath and so force himself to get out, nor could he find in himself the willpower to step out of it like a man. He had often heard people tell him that he possessed character, and he reflected that people judge hastily in the affairs of life because they judge on insufficient evidence. They had never seen him in a hot, but diminishingly hot, bath. His mind, however, wandered back to his play, and telling himself jokes and repartees that he knew by bitter experience would never look so neat on paper nor sound so well on the stage as they did then. He abstracted his mind from the fact that his bath was growing almost tepid when he heard a knock at the door. Since he did not want anyone to enter, he had the presence of mind not to say "come in," but the knocking was repeated. "Who is it?" he cried irascibly. "A letter." "Come in, then. Wait a minute." Ashenden heard his bedroom door open, and getting out of the bath, flung a towel round him and went in. A page boy was waiting with a note. It needed only a verbal answer. It was from a lady staying in the hotel asking him to play bridge after dinner, and was signed in the continental fashion, Baron de Higgins. Ashenden, longing for a cosy meal in his own room, in slippers and with a book leaned up against a reading lamp, was about to refuse when it occurred to him that in the circumstances it might be discreet to show himself in the dining room that night. It was absurd to suppose that in that hotel the news would not have spread that he had been visited by the police, and it would be as well to prove to his fellow guests that he was not disconcerted. It had passed through his mind that it might be someone in the hotel who had denounced him, and indeed the name of the sprightly Baroness had not failed to suggest itself to him. If it was she who had given him away, there would be a certain humour in playing bridge with her. He gave the boy a message that he would be pleased to come, and proceeded slowly to don his evening clothes. The Baroness von Higgins was an Austrian who, on settling in Geneva during the first winter of the war, had found it convenient to make her name look as French as possible. She spoke English and French perfectly. Her surname, so far from Teutonic, she owed to her grandfather, a Yorkshire stable boy who had been taken over to Austria by a Prince Blankenstein early in the 19th century. He had had a charming and romantic career. A very good-looking man, he attracted the attention of one of the archduchesses, and then made such good use of his opportunities that he ended his life as a baron and minister plenipotentiary to an Italian court. The Baroness, his only descendant, after an unhappy marriage, the particulars of which she was fond of relating to her acquaintance, had resumed her maiden name. She mentioned not infrequently the fact that her grandfather had been an ambassador, but never that he had been a stable boy, and Ashenden had learned this interesting detail from Vienna. For as he grew friendly with her, he had thought it necessary to get a few particulars about her past, and he knew, among other things, that her private income did not permit her to live on the somewhat lavish scale on which she was living in Geneva. Since she had so many advantages for espionage, it was fairly safe to suppose that an alert secret service had enlisted her services, and Ashenden took it for granted that she was engaged somehow on the same kind of work as himself. It increased, if anything, the cordiality of his relations with her. When he went into the dining room, it was already full. He sat down at his table and, feeling jaunty after his adventure, ordered himself, at the expense of the British government, a bottle of champagne. The Baroness gave him a flashing, brilliant smile. She was a woman of more than 40, but in a hard and glittering manner extremely beautiful. She was a high-coloured blonde with golden hair of a metallic lustre, lovely no doubt, but not attractive, and Ashenden had from the first reflected that it was not the sort of hair you would like to find in your soup. She had fine features, blue eyes, a straight nose, and a pink and white skin. But her skin was stretched over her bones a trifle tightly. She was generously décolletée, and her white and ample bosom had the quality of marble. There was nothing in her appearance to suggest the yielding tenderness that the susceptible finds so alluring. She was magnificently gowned, but scantily bejewelled, so that Ashenden, who knew something of these matters, concluded that the superior authority had given her carte blanche at a dressmaker's, but had not thought it prudent or necessary to provide her with rings or pearls. She was notwithstanding so showy that, but for R's story of the minister, Ashenden would have thought the sight of her alone must have aroused in anyone on whom she desired to exercise her wiles the sense of prudence. While he waited for his dinner to be served, Ashenden cast his eyes over the company. Most of the persons gathered were old friends by sight. At that time, Geneva was a hotbed of intrigue, and its home was the hotel at which Ashenden was staying. There were Frenchmen there, Italians and Russians, Turks, Romanians, Greeks, and Egyptians. Some had fled their country, some doubtless represented it. There was a Bulgarian, an agent of Ashenden's, whom, for greater safety, he had never even spoken to in Geneva. He was dining that night with two fellow countrymen, and in a day or so, if he was not killed in the interval, might have a very interesting communication to make. Then there was a little German prostitute with china blue eyes and a doll-like face, who made frequent journeys along the lake and up to Bern, and in the exercise of her profession got little titbits of information over which doubtless they pondered with deliberation in Berlin. She was, of course, of a different class from the Baroness, and hunted much easier game. But Ashenden was surprised to catch sight of Count von Holzminden, and wondered what on earth he was doing there. This was the German agent in Vevey, and he came over to Geneva only on occasion. Once Ashenden had seen him in the old quarter of the city, with its silent houses and deserted streets, talking at a corner to a man whose appearance very much suggested the spy, and he would have given a great deal to hear what they said to one another. It had amused him to come across the Count, for in London before the war he had known him fairly well. He was of great family, and indeed related to the Hohenzollerns. He was fond of England, he danced well, rode well, and shot well. People said he was more English than the English. He was a tall, thin fellow, in well-cut clothes, with a close-cropped Prussian head, and that peculiar bend of the body, as though he were just about to bow to a royalty that you feel, rather than see, in those who have spent their lives about a court. He had charming manners, and was much interested in the fine arts. But now Ashenden and he pretended they had never seen one another before. Each, of course, knew on what work the other was engaged, and Ashenden had had a mind to chaff him about it. It seemed absurd, when he had dined with a man off and on for years and played cards with him, to act as though he did not know him from Adam, but refrained, in case the German looked upon his behavior as further proof of the British frivolity in face of war. Ashenden was perplexed. Holzminden had never set foot in that hotel before, and it was unlikely that he had done so now without good reason. Ashenden asked himself whether this event had anything to do with the unusual presence in the dining-room of Prince Ali. At that juncture, it was imprudent to ascribe any occurrence, however accidental it looked, to the hazard of coincidence. Prince Ali was an Egyptian, a near relation of the Khedive, who had fled his country when the Khedive was deposed. He was a bitter enemy of the English, and was known to be actively engaged in stirring up trouble in Egypt. The week before, the Khedive, in great secrecy, had passed 3 days at the hotel, and the pair of them had held constant meetings in the prince's apartments. He was a little fat man with a heavy black moustache. He was living with his 2 daughters and a certain Pasha, Mustafa by name, who was his secretary and managed his affairs. The 4 of them were now dining together. They drank a great deal of champagne, but sat in a stolid silence. The 2 princesses were emancipated young women who spent their nights dancing in restaurants with the bloods of Geneva. They were short and stout, with fine black eyes and heavy, sallow faces, and they were dressed with a rich loudness that suggested the fish market at Cairo rather than the Rue de la Paix. His Highness usually ate upstairs, but the princesses dined every evening in the public dining-room. They were chaperoned vaguely by a little old Englishwoman, a Miss King, who had been their governess. But she sat at a table by herself, and they appeared to pay no attention to her. Once Ashenden, going along a corridor, had come upon the elder of the two fat princesses berating the governess in French with a violence that took his breath away. She was shouting at the top of her voice and suddenly smacked the old woman's face. When she caught sight of Ashenden, she gave him a furious look and, flinging into her room, slammed the door. He walked on as though he had noticed nothing. On his arrival, Ashenden had tried to scrape acquaintance with Miss King, but she had received his advances not merely with frigidity, but with churlishness. He had begun by taking off his hat when he met her, and she had given him a stiff bow. Then he had addressed her, and she had answered with such brevity that it was evident that she wished to have nothing much to do with him. But it was not his business to be discouraged, so with what assurance he could muster, he took the first opportunity to enter into conversation with her. She drew herself up and said in French, but with an English accent, "I don't wish to make acquaintance with strangers." She turned her back on him, and next time he saw her, cut him dead. She was a tiny woman, just a few little bones in a bag of wrinkled skin, and her face was deeply furrowed. It was obvious that she wore a wig. It was of a mousy brown, very elaborate, and not always set quite straight, and she was heavily made up, with great patches of scarlet on her withered cheeks and brilliantly red lips. She dressed fantastically in gay clothes that looked as though they had been bought higgledy-piggledy from an old clothes shop, and in the daytime she wore enormous, extravagantly girlish hats. She tripped along in very small, smart shoes with very high heels. Her appearance was so grotesque that it created consternation rather than amusement. People turned in the street and stared at her with open mouths. Ashenden was told that Miss King had not been to England since she was first engaged as governess of the prince's mother, and he could not but be amazed to think of all she must have seen during those long years in the harems of Cairo. It was impossible to guess how old she was. How many of those short Eastern lives must have run their course under her eyes, and what dark secrets must she have known? Ashenden wondered where she came from. An exile from her own country for so long, she must possess in it neither family nor friends. He knew that her sentiments were anti-English, and if she had answered him so rudely, he surmised that she had been told to be on her guard against him. She never spoke anything but French. Ashenden wondered what it was she thought of as she sat there, at luncheon and dinner by herself. He wondered if ever she read. After meals, she went straight upstairs and was never seen in the public sitting rooms. He wondered what she thought of those two emancipated princesses who wore garish frocks and danced with strange men in second-rate cafes. But when Miss King passed him on her way out of the dining room, it seemed to Ashenden that her mask of a face scowled. She appeared actively to dislike him. Her gaze met his, and the pair of them looked at one another for a moment. He imagined that she tried to put into her stare an unspoken insult. It would have been pleasantly absurd in that painted, withered visage if it had not been for some reason rather oddly pathetic. But now the Baroness de Higgins, having finished her dinner, gathered up her handkerchief and her bag, and with waiters bowing on either side, sailed down the spacious room. She stopped at Ashenden's table. She looked magnificent. "I'm so glad you can play bridge tonight," she said in perfect English, with no more than a trace of German accent. "Will you come to my sitting-room when you are ready and have your coffee?" "What a lovely dress," said Ashenden. "It is frightful. I have nothing to wear. I don't know what I shall do now that I cannot go to Paris. Those horrible Prussians," and her R's grew guttural as she raised her voice. "Why did they want to drag my poor country into this terrible war?" She gave a sigh and a flashing smile and sailed on. Ashenden was among the last to finish, and when he left the dining room, it was almost empty. As he walked past Count Holzminden, Ashenden, feeling very gay, hazarded the shadow of a wink. The German agent could not be quite sure of it, and if he suspected it might rack his brains to discover what mystery it portended. Ashenden walked up to the second floor and knocked at the Baroness's door. "Entrez! Entrez!" she said, and flung it open. She shook both his hands with cordiality and drew him into the room. He saw that the two persons who were to make the four had already arrived. They were Prince Ali and his secretary. Ashenden was astounded. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Ashenden to your Highness," said the Baroness, speaking in her fluent French. Ashenden bowed and took the proffered hand. The prince gave him a quick look, but did not speak. Madame de Higgins went on, "I do not know if you have met the Pasha." "I am delighted to make your acquaintance, Mr. Ashenden," said the prince's secretary, warmly shaking his hand. "Our beautiful Baroness has talked to us of your bridge, and His Highness is devoted to the game. N'est-ce pas, Altesse?" "Oui, oui," said the prince. Mustafa Pasha was a huge fat fellow, of 45 perhaps, with large mobile eyes and a big black moustache. He wore a dinner jacket with a large diamond in his shirt front and the tarbouche of his country. He was exceedingly voluble, and the words tumbled out of his mouth tumultuously, like marbles out of a bag. He took pains to be extremely civil to Ashenden. The prince sat in silence, looking at Ashenden quietly from under his heavy eyelids. He seemed shy. "I have not seen you at the club, monsieur," said the Pasha. "Do you not like baccarat?" "I play but seldom. The Baroness, who has read everything, tells me that you are a remarkable writer. Unfortunately, I do not read English." The Baroness paid Ashenden some very fulsome compliments, to which he listened with a proper and grateful politeness, and then, having provided her guests with coffee and liqueurs, she produced the cards. Ashenden could not but wonder why he had been asked to play. He had, he flattered himself, few illusions about himself, and so far as bridge was concerned, none. He knew that he was a good player of the second class, but he had played often enough with the best players in the world to know that he was not in the same street with them. The game played now was contract, with which he was not very familiar, and the stakes were high. But the game was obviously but a pretext, and Ashenden had no notion what other game was being played under the rose. It might be that, knowing he was a British agent, the prince and his secretary had desired to see him in order to find out what sort of person he was. Ashenden had felt for a day or two that something was in the air, and this meeting confirmed his suspicions, but he had not the faintest notion of what nature this something was. His spies had told him of late nothing that signified. He was now persuaded that he owed that visit of the Swiss police to the kindly intervention of the Baroness, and it looked as though the bridge party had been arranged when it was discovered that the detectives had been able to do nothing. The notion was mysterious, but diverting, and as Ashenden played one rubber after another, joining in the incessant conversation, he watched what was said by himself no less closely than what was said by the others. The war was spoken of a good deal, and the Baroness and the Pasha expressed very anti-German sentiments. The Baroness's heart was in England, whence her family, the stable boy from Yorkshire, had sprung, and the Pasha looked upon Paris as his spiritual home. When the Pasha talked of Montmartre and its life by night, the prince was roused from his silence. "C'est une bien belle ville, Paris," he said. "The prince has a beautiful apartment there," said his secretary, "with beautiful pictures and life-sized statues." Ashenden explained that he had the greatest sympathy for the national aspirations of Egypt, and that he looked upon Vienna as the most pleasing capital in Europe. He was as friendly to them as they were to him. But if they were under the impression that they would get any information out of him that they had not already seen in the Swiss papers, he had a notion that they were mistaken. At one moment he had a suspicion that he was being sounded upon the possibility of selling himself. It was done so discreetly that he could not be quite sure, but he had a feeling that a suggestion floated in the air that a clever writer could do his country a good turn and make a vast amount of money for himself if he cared to enter into an arrangement that would bring to a troubled world the peace that every humane man must so sincerely desire. It was plain that nothing very much would be said that first evening, but Ashenden, as evasively as he could, more by general amiability than by words, tried to indicate that he was willing to hear more of the subject. While he talked with the Pasha and the beautiful Austrian, he was conscious that the watchful eyes of Prince Ali were upon him, and had an uneasy suspicion that they read too much of his thoughts. He felt rather than knew that the prince was an able and astute man. It was possible that after he left them, the prince would tell the other two that they were wasting their time, and there was nothing to be done with Ashenden. Soon after midnight, a rubber having been finished, the prince rose from the table. "It is getting late," he said, "and Mr. Ashenden has doubtless much to do tomorrow. We must not keep him up." Ashenden looked upon this as a signal to take himself off. He left the three together to discuss the situation and retired not a little mystified. He could only trust that they were no less puzzled than he. When he got to his room, he suddenly realized that he was dog-tired. He could hardly keep his eyes open while he undressed, and the moment he flung himself into bed, he fell asleep. He would have sworn that he had not been asleep 5 minutes when he was dragged back to wakefulness by a knocking at the door. He listened for a moment. "Who is it?" "It's the maid. Open. I have something to say to you." Cursing, Ashenden turned on his light, ran a hand through his thinning and rumpled hair, for like Julius Caesar he disliked exposing an unbecoming baldness, and unlocked and opened the door. Outside it stood a tousled Swiss maid. She wore no apron and looked as though she had thrown on her clothes in a hurry. "The old English lady, the governess of the Egyptian princesses, is dying, and she wants to see you." "Me," said Ashenden. "It's impossible. I don't know her. She was all right this evening." He was confused and spoke his thoughts as they came to him. "She asks for you. The doctor says, will you come? She cannot last much longer." "It must be a mistake. She can't want me." "She said your name and the number of your room. She says, quick, quick." Ashenden shrugged his shoulders. He went back into his room to put on slippers and a dressing gown, and as an afterthought dropped a small revolver into his pocket. Ashenden believed much more in his acuteness than in a firearm, which is apt to go off at the wrong time and make a noise. But there are moments when it gives you confidence to feel your fingers round its butt, and this sudden summons seemed to him exceedingly mysterious. It was ridiculous to suppose that those two cordial, stout Egyptian gentlemen were laying some sort of trap for him, but in the work upon which Ashenden was engaged, the dullness of routine was apt now and again to slip quite shamelessly into the melodrama of the 60s. Just as passion will make use brazenly of the hackneyed phrase, so will chance show itself insensitive to the triteness of the literary convention. Miss King's room was 2 floors higher than Ashenden's, and as he accompanied the chambermaid along the corridor and up the stairs, he asked her what was the matter with the old governess. She was flurried and stupid. "I think she has had a stroke, I don't know. The night porter woke me and said Monsieur Bridet wanted me to get up at once." Monsieur Bridet was the assistant manager. "What is the time?" asked Ashenden. "It must be 3 o'clock." They arrived at Miss King's door, and the maid knocked. It was opened by Monsieur Bridet. He had evidently been roused from his sleep. He wore slippers on his bare feet, grey trousers, and a frock-coat over his pyjamas. He looked absurd. His hair, as a rule plastered neatly on his head, stood on end. He was extremely apologetic. "1,000 excuses for disturbing you, Monsieur Ashenden, but she kept asking for you, and the doctor said you should be sent for." It doesn't matter at all. Ashenden walked in. It was a small back room, and all the lights were on. The windows were closed, and the curtains drawn. It was intensely hot. The doctor, a bearded, grizzled Swiss, was standing at the bedside. Monsieur Bridet, notwithstanding his costume and his evident harassment, found in himself the presence of mind to remain the attentive manager, and with ceremony effected the proper introduction. "This is Mr. Ashenden, for whom Miss King has been asking, Dr. Arbos, of the Faculty of Medicine of Geneva." Without a word, the doctor pointed to the bed. On it lay Miss King. It gave Ashenden a shock to look at her. She wore a large white cotton nightcap. On entering, Ashenden had noticed the brown wig on a stand on the dressing table, tied under the chin, and a white, voluminous nightdress that came high up in the neck. Nightcap and nightdress belonged to a past age and reminded you of Cruikshank's illustrations to the novels of Charles Dickens. Her face was greasy still with the cream she had used before going to bed to remove her makeup, but she had removed it summarily, and there were streaks of black on her eyebrows and of red on her cheeks. She looked very small, lying in the bed, no larger than a child, and immensely old. She must be well over 80, thought Ashenden. She did not look human, but like a doll, the caricature of an old witch that an ironic toymaker had amused himself with modeling. She lay perfectly still on her back, the tiny little body hardly marked under the flatness of the blanket, her face even smaller than usual because she had removed her teeth, and you would have thought she was dead, but for the black eyes, strangely large in the shrunken mask, that stared unblinkingly. Ashenden thought their expression changed when she saw him. "Well, Miss King, I'm sorry to see you like this," he said with forced cheerfulness. "She cannot speak," said the doctor. "She had another little stroke when the maid went to fetch you. I have just given her an injection. She may partly recover the use of her tongue in a little while. She has something to say to you." "I will gladly wait," said Ashenden. He fancied that in those dark eyes he saw a look of relief. For a moment or two, the four of them stood round the bed and stared at the dying woman. "Well, if there is nothing I can do, I may just as well go back to bed," said Monsieur Bridet then. "Allez, mon ami," said the doctor. "You can do nothing." Monsieur Bridet turned to Ashenden. "May I have a word with you?" he asked. "Certainly." The doctor noticed a sudden fear in Miss King's eyes. "Do not be alarmed," he said kindly. "Monsieur Ashenden is not going. He will stay as long as you wish." The assistant manager took Ashenden to the door and partly closed it so that those within should not hear his undertones. "I can count on your discretion, Monsieur Ashenden, can I not? It is a very disagreeable thing to have anyone die in a hotel. The other guests do not like it, and we must do all we can to prevent their knowing. I shall have the body removed the first possible moment, and I shall be extremely obliged if you will not say that there has been a death." "You can have every confidence in me," said Ashenden. "It is very unfortunate that the manager should be away for the night. I am afraid he will be exceedingly displeased. Of course, if it had been possible, I would have sent for an ambulance and had her taken to the hospital, but the doctor said she might die before we got her downstairs and absolutely refused to let me. It is not my fault if she dies in the hotel." "Death so often chooses its moments without consideration," murmured Ashenden. "After all, she is an old woman. She should have died years ago. What did this Egyptian prince want to have a governess of that age for? He ought to have sent her back to her own country. These Orientals, they are always giving trouble." "Where is the prince now?" asked Ashenden. "She has been in his service for many years. Ought you not to wake him?" "He is not in the hotel. He went out with his secretary. He may be playing baccarat." "I do not know. Anyhow, I cannot send all over Geneva to find him. And the princesses? They have not come in. They seldom return to the hotel till dawn. They are mad about dancing. I do not know where they are. In any case, they would not thank me for dragging them away from their diversions because their governess has had a stroke. I know what they are. The night porter will tell them when they arrive, and then they can please themselves. She does not want them. When the night porter fetched me, and I went into her room, I asked where His Highness was, and she cried with all her strength, "No, no." She could talk then? Yes, after a fashion, but the thing that surprised me was that she spoke in English. She always insisted on talking French. You know, she hated the English. What did she want with me? That I cannot tell you. She said she had something that she must say to you at once. It is funny, she knew the number of your room. At first, when she asked for you, I would not let them send. I cannot have my clients disturbed in the middle of the night because a crazy old woman asks for them. You have the right to your sleep, I imagine. But when the doctor came, he insisted. She gave us no peace, and when I said she must wait till morning, she cried. Ashenden looked at the assistant manager. He seemed to find nothing at all touching in the scene he related. The doctor asked who you were, and when I told him, he said that perhaps she wished to see you because you were a compatriot. Perhaps, said Ashenden dryly. Well, I shall try to get a little sleep. I shall give the night porter orders to wake me when everything is over. Fortunately, the nights are long now, and if everything goes well, we may be able to get the body away before it is light. Ashenden went back into the room, and immediately the dark eyes of the dying woman fixed upon him. He felt that it was incumbent upon him to say something, but as he spoke, he reflected on the foolish way in which one speaks to the sick. "I'm afraid you're feeling very ill, Miss King." It seemed to him that a flash of anger crossed her eyes, and Ashenden could not but imagine that she was exasperated by his futile words. "You do not mind waiting?" asked the doctor. "Of course not." It appeared that the night porter had been roused by the ringing of the telephone from Miss King's room, but on listening, could get no one to speak. The bell continued to ring, so he went upstairs and knocked at the door. He entered with his pass key and found Miss King lying on the floor. The telephone had fallen too. It looked as though, feeling ill, she had taken off the receiver to call for help and then collapsed. The night porter hurried to fetch the assistant manager, and together they had lifted her back into bed. Then the maid was wakened, and the doctor sent for. It gave Ashenden a queer feeling to listen to the doctor giving him these facts in Miss King's hearing. He spoke as though she could not understand his French. He spoke as though she were already dead. Then the doctor said, "Well, there is really nothing more that I can do. It is useless for me to stay. I can be rung up if there is any change." Ashenden, knowing that Miss King might remain in that condition for hours, shrugged his shoulders. "Very well." The doctor patted her raddled cheek as though she were a child. "You must try to sleep. I will come back in the morning." He packed up the dispatch case in which he had his medical appliances, washed his hands, and shuffled himself into a heavy coat. Ashenden accompanied him to the door, and as he shook hands, the doctor gave his prognosis in a pout of his bearded mouth. Ashenden, coming back, looked at the maid. She sat on the edge of a chair uneasily, as though in the presence of death she feared to presume. Her broad, ugly face was bloated with fatigue. "There's no use in your staying up," Ashenden said to her. "Why don't you go to bed? Monsieur wouldn't like to remain here alone. Somebody must stay with him." "But good heavens, why? You have your day's work to do tomorrow." "In any case, I have to get up at 5. "Then try to get a little sleep now. You can give me a look-in when you get up. Allez." She rose heavily to her feet. "As the gentleman wishes, but I will stay very willingly." Ashenden smiled and shook his head. Bonsoir, ma pauvre mademoiselle, said the maid. She went out, and Ashenden was left alone. He sat by the bedside, and again his eyes met Miss King's. It was embarrassing to encounter that unshrinking stare. "Don't worry yourself, Miss King. You've had a slight stroke. I'm sure your speech will come back to you in a minute." He felt certain then that he saw in those dark eyes a desperate effort to speak. He could not be mistaken. The mind was shaken by desire, but the paralyzed body was incapable of obedience. For her disappointment expressed itself quite plainly. Tears came to her eyes and ran down her cheeks. Ashenden took out his handkerchief and dried them. "Don't distress yourself, Miss King. Have a little patience, and I'm sure you'll be able to say anything you want." He did not know if it was his fancy that he read in her eyes now, the despairing thought that she had not the time to wait. Perhaps it was only that he ascribed to her the notions that came to himself. On the dressing-table were the governess's poor little toilet things, silver-backed embossed brushes and a silver mirror. In a corner stood a shabby black trunk, and on the top of the wardrobe a large hat-box in shiny leather. It all looked poor and mean in that trim hotel room, with its suite in highly varnished rosewood. The glare was intolerable. "Wouldn't you be more comfortable if I turned out some of the lights?" asked Ashenden. He put out all the lamps but the one by the bedside, and then sat down again. He had a longing to smoke. Once more his eyes were held by those other eyes, in which was all that remained alive of that old, old woman. He felt certain that she had something that she wanted urgently to say to him. But what was it? What was it? Perhaps she had asked him only because, feeling death near, she had had a sudden yearning, she the exile of so many years, to die with someone of her own people, so long forgotten by her side. That was what the doctor thought. But why should she have sent for him? There were other English people in the hotel. There was an old pair, a retired Indian civilian and his wife, to whom it seemed more natural that she should turn. No one could be more of a stranger to her than Ashenden. "Have you got something to say to me, Miss King?" He tried to read an answer in her eyes. They continued to stare at him meaningly, but what the meaning was, he had no notion. "Don't be afraid I shall go. I will stay as long as you want me." Nothing, nothing. The black eyes, and as he looked at them, they seemed to glow mysteriously as though there were fire behind them. The eyes continued to hold him with that insistent stare. Then Ashenden asked himself if she had sent for him because she knew that he was a British agent. Was it possible that at that last moment she had had some unexpected revulsion of feeling from everything that had signified to her for so many years? Perhaps at the moment of death a love for her country, a love that had been dead for half a century, awakened again in her. "I'm silly to fancy these idiotic things," thought Ashenden. "It's cheap and tawdry fiction." And she had been seized with a desire to do something for what was after all her own. No one was quite himself just then, and patriotism, in peacetime, an attitude best left to politicians, publicists, and fools, but in the dark days of war, an emotion that can wring the heartstrings. Patriotism made one do odd things. It was curious that she had been unwilling to see the prince and his daughters. Did she on a sudden hate them? Did she feel herself a traitor on their account, and now at the last hour wish to make amends? It's all very improbable. She's just a silly old maid who ought to have died years ago. But you couldn't ignore the improbable. Ashenden, his common sense protesting, became strangely convinced that she had some secret that she wished to impart to him. She had sent for him knowing who he was, because he could make use of it. She was dying and feared nothing. But was it really important? Ashenden leaned forward, trying more eagerly to read what her eyes had to say. Perhaps it was only some trivial thing that was important only in her addled old brain. Ashenden was sick of the people who saw spies in every inoffensive passerby and plots in the most innocent combination of circumstances. It was 100 to 1 that if Miss King recovered her speech, she would tell him something that could be of no use to anybody. But how much must that old woman know? With her sharp eyes and sharp ears, she must have had the chance to discover matters that were closely hidden from persons that seemed less insignificant. Ashenden thought again how he had the impression that something of real consequence was being prepared round about him. It was curious that Holzminden should have come to the hotel that day, and why had Prince Ali and the Pasha, those wild gamblers, wasted an evening in playing contract bridge with him? It might be that some new plan was in question. It might be that the very greatest affairs were afoot, and perhaps what the old woman had to say might make all the difference in the world. It might mean defeat or victory. It might mean anything. And there she lay powerless to speak. For a long time, Ashenden stared at her in silence. "Has it got anything to do with the war, Miss King?" he said on a sudden, loudly. Something passed through her eyes, and a tremor shot across her little old face. It was a distinct movement. Something strange and horrible was happening, and Ashenden held his breath. The tiny, frail body was suddenly convulsed, and that old woman, as though by a final desperate effort of will, raised herself up in the bed. Ashenden sprang forward to support her. "England," she said, just that one word, in a harsh, cracked voice, and fell back in his arms. When he laid her down on the pillow, he saw that she was dead.